Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this Psychiatry and Spirituality Forum event with Professor Dallas Willard. I am very honored to have managed to get Professor Willard here at UC Irvine, which is not easy, but I had a little help from my friends. I want to thank Howard and Roberta Amundsen from Fieldstead and Company, who have partnered with the Psychiatry and Spirituality Forum to make this evening's event possible. I want to thank them for their generosity. Now, for some of you, this may be the first of our events that you've attended, so I want to just take 2 minutes to briefly explain what it is we do here at UC Irvine with the project, and then I'm going to invite Roberta Amundsen up to introduce this evening's speaker. According to the mission statement of the Psychiatry and Spirituality Forum, we are dedicated to recognizing, appreciating, and exploring the connections between a patient's mental health and their spiritual, religious, philosophical, and moral convictions. Well, this evening's lecture will explore the status of such moral convictions. Is reliable moral knowledge possible? Those of us involved in the forum, all collectively, although we may be coming from different backgrounds, collectively we rest upon some fundamental convictions in terms of our work with patients and in the field of psychiatry. We believe that human beings are naturally oriented towards transcendent meaning and purpose, and that they are fulfilled through relationships of self-giving love. We recognize that human health and flourishing, including mental health, requires the acquisition and growth in freedom and the virtues. Now, this idea that moral knowledge may somehow be connected to mental health is admittedly a bold proposition, and one that obviously many people in the mental health professions don't share. Our activities are aimed at developing a fuller, a richer, a more complete view of the human person that can be applied to our psychiatric work, our work in healing mental illness and distress. And in doing this, we recognize that we have to draw on not only modern science, which we, of course, value, but we need to learn from the world's great philosophical, religious, and spiritual traditions as well. And one final comment about the forum, and that's in regards to this evening's event. We do curriculum development, we do research, we do scholarly activities here at the university, and that's important. But it's also very important for us and for the university as a whole to reach out to the local community, because the university should not exist for itself, but in order to serve society, and particularly to serve the local community. So many of our events, like the one tonight, are open to the public, and it has always been edifying for me. These are my favorite aspect of what we do, because it's edifying to see people who have a stake in this, who have an interest in this, coming to hear and to be a part of our ongoing conversation. So with that, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague Roberta Amundsen, who will introduce Professor Willard.
Thank you, Aaron. I have to begin my introduction with an apology, which is for my voice. I've lost part of it, so if I squeak, please just overlook it. It's my privilege to be able to introduce Dallas Willard tonight. He's someone I've had the privilege to know for, I think, 20 years, and who have heard several times, and he's one of those people that you can't get enough of. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce him tonight. Kind of amphibian. He is both a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California, where he has been director of the Department of Philosophy, where he has won the Student Senate Award for the Outstanding Faculty of the Year. He's published on philosophy, on philosophy of the mind and logic, on the work of Edmund Husserl. On the other side, he is someone who has written what I think are some of the most important books on Christian spirituality in the 20th and 21st century. Two of his books have won Christianity Today's Book of the Year awards. And I can speak personally that one of his, well, I've been reading Dallas ever since I knew about him, but one of his books came at a particular time in my life. I've struggled with anger. I'm sure no one else in this room ever has. And so this will be like a novel thing to tell you about. And it was at a particular juncture of my life where it was like my anger leaped out of my mouth and came back to bite me. Has that ever happened to you? It just bang in my face. And frankly, it left me speechless and terrified of myself. Dallas's book, Renovation of the Heart, had just come out, and I'd been putting off reading it, I think because I knew it was going to point several fingers at me, and I would have to deal with myself. And indeed, it did, but I started reading it the next morning, and two lessons from that book have stuck with me ever since, and I don't pretend that I am a model of living them out, but I am a model of being reminded of them on an almost daily basis. And the one is abandon all defensiveness, and the other is to abandon all outcomes. And what those two things mean, you know, when we're defensive, it means that something has pricked some precious part of ourselves, our ego, our pride that we're protecting. And if we can let go of that, we can hear other people much better. And if we can abandon all outcomes, we can quit trying to control anything. And those of you who either have or have been children know that there are certain characteristics of parents that lead to control issues. And if we can let go of those, things are much better. So I know that what Dallas will have to say tonight is going to be enlightening and enriching to us all, and it's my privilege to give you Professor Dallas Willard.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here and to see many of you again and to meet many new friends. Thank you for those kind words, Roberta. And I'm always glad to be introduced by a friend and not an enemy. But on the other hand, sometimes you think maybe the enemy might do you more good by humbling you. But thank you, Roberta, so much. Now, this evening, I want to talk to you about something that I've been working on for quite a long while. It's mainly in philosophy, but philosophy, the way I do it, is centered on life. And actually, that's what philosophy has been about for most of its history. It has become a professional occupation in the last 150 years or so. But when you think of the great philosophers through the ages, you're going to be thinking of people who were concerned about wisdom lived out in life. And so this particular thing I've been working on is in the process of becoming a book, which I'm hopeful will be finished by the end of this year. And the title of it is The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. Now, that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, the disappearance of moral knowledge. Actually, it is a hidden cultural calamity of growing proportions. And I want to try to explain to you this evening what it is and some of the reasons why it came to pass, and then what it means for us, for life, for our culture, and for the individuals that we are and that we know and love. So that's the project now. And I will not have time to say everything I don't mean by what I say, but we're going to have questions in a little while and comments. And so please, if you have concerns as we go along, if you just jot those down, then I'll be the target. And the hard questions are the best ones. So just keep that in mind. Now, let's begin with the statement about what the disappearance of moral knowledge is. And I want to be very clear. I don't mean to say that there is no such thing as moral knowledge. There is. And your cases. You already know them. You may have some trouble placing them because of the confusion of our public discourse. But there is moral knowledge. I'm not going to say that no one has it. Many people do. Many of you have it. But again, it's very likely that you don't quite know what to do with it, especially in conversations, because the circumstances of our existence have changed in ways I will talk some about, so that we often are intimidated when it comes to moral issues. And I hope by the end of my little talk, or the end of the discussion sections at least, you may be clearer about why that is and what you might do about it. But let's just start with the description of the disappearance of moral knowledge. It is a social reality. And now on your sheets you have some wording which I like to bring and hand out, because if I just flash it on the screen, I think very few people get it down. And also you can take this home with you and put it on your bathroom mirror or someplace. The disappearance of moral knowledge is the social reality that the knowledge institutions, primarily the universities and also the churches, and I put that in quotation so we can cover a little more than the Christian religious background, knowledge institutions of our society do not offer knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice to the public. They do not offer it as knowledge. It is not a part of testable cognitive content of any recognized area of scholarship or practice. Now, perhaps I can nail that down just by saying that if you were teaching and you were to ask a question about what is good or evil, right or wrong, obligatory to do or not to do, you would not be able to grade the student on the answer. And if you did grade the student and the student didn't like your grade, they could appeal that up the line. And eventually, if they were persistent, it would wind up in the courts. And perhaps as it went up the line, your dean or your administrator might say to you, now, Mr., Mrs., Professor, whatever, we of course know that it's wrong to run over children in the street with your automobile by choice. We know that's wrong. Or to kick a baby through a goalpost just to hear it flop. We, of course, know that that's wrong. But we mustn't impose our views on our students with reference to moral issues. Now, I'm pausing just to ask you to think about that. I'm trying to make it as concrete as possible. What does it mean that moral knowledge has disappeared from our culture? It means that the institutions of knowledge cannot present moral truth or ethical truth as something of which there is knowledge. Okay? Now, I'm hoping you're going to want to fight me about this, because I go around the world saying all this stuff, and if I'm wrong about it, I need to know. Right? So you can help me by contesting what I say. I'm not interested in winning. I want to know what is the case. Okay? Now, let's talk just a little bit about knowledge, because, of course, the world is full of moral judgments and moral feelings and moral fights. And usually your evening news or your newspaper is full of bad stuff that people have done, and they're really coming down on them. The priests who have abused children, or pastors who have abused children sexually. Tiger Woods. And on the list goes. Right? So we're loaded with emotions, with feelings, with fights, moral fights. See, the moral life does not stop. It can't stop. And this is a part of what I want to emphasize in a little while. The moral life is so central to human life that you can't call it off. Because the moral life has to do with choices that we make. And those choices have to do with the kind of people we become. And the kind of people we become is not a matter that is indifferent to us or to others. You're in the realm of fact already when you get into morality, because morality has to do with life. So we can't dispense with it. We can't just say, well, we'll check out. I quit engaging in moral feeling, in moral judgment, in moral beliefs. You can't do that. No one can. So now we have to think about the significance that, with all of that true, moral knowledge is set aside. So now, next paragraph on your sheet, we have to talk a little bit about knowledge. Knowledge is what this university is about, I hope. Though if it's like my university, very few people are willing to talk about knowledge any longer. Again, check it out. I make a point, especially if I have a large freshman class, of starting out by talking to them about knowledge. The way I go about it is to say, why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why are you paying money? And engaging yourself for some lugubrious evenings setting up, studying obscure texts. Why are you doing that? You might be surprised how long it takes to get around to knowledge. Knowledge is scary. People are frightened of knowledge because they think it will pin them down. That's because knowledge involves truth. And the truth will not only set you free, it will make you flee. It's scary. Now, it's scary, again, because of its reality in life. See, we depend upon people knowing what they're doing in any area of professional work. You want people who have knowledge, not just sentiment, not just belief. If you hear your dentist saying, well, maybe that tooth is the one, you probably want to get out of the chair real fast. You want people to know. See, that's because truth is vital to life. Truth is like the sighting mechanism on a gun. If it's right, then you can hit the target. And truth is like that. Truth is what you need to hit the target. But truth is bitter. It does not make any allowance for what you think or feel or what you wish or hope. And if you're wrong, you're in trouble. Right? Also, knowledge involves public method. Where you have knowledge, you have access to truth by method. And those two things about knowledge are missing if you can't have moral knowledge. And you might begin to get alarmed right at that point, because after all, you might say to yourself, well, moral beliefs and thoughts are among the most important ones in our life. And if you can't have knowledge, if you can't have truth, if you can't have method with those, we are in real trouble. Now, you might have gathered that from just looking around you. How do people wind up in such incredible messes? How do they wind up in situations where their mental health is gone? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, and I want at this point to emphasize I'm not saying what I'm talking about is the solution to all the problems, but it is a very major part of the solutions to many problems that individuals face. So now I'm still on the second paragraph. We want to think about what you lose when you lose knowledge. And you lose four main things. When you lose knowledge, you lose the right and responsibility to act. Knowledge authorizes and perhaps requires certain actions. If you have knowledge, you have the right and the responsibility to act. That's why sometimes when people see us going wrong, they say things like, "What do you think you are doing?" And possibly even, "Who do you think you are?" Right? See? Because if it appears that we do not have knowledge about what we're doing, then we don't have the right, much less the responsibility to do it. Now, if it's something perfectly trivial, like golf, it doesn't matter. Right? There, you don't have to know anything, though it might help. So there are lots of games and things. It doesn't matter. But for real life, it matters a lot. Knowledge gives us the right and the responsibility to act, to direct action, to formulate policy and supervise it, and to teach. To teach. If you're going to do those things, you need to have knowledge. Now, having said that, I think you can begin to see what an incredible difference it makes whether or not there is moral knowledge. Because if there isn't, that means the right to act, to supervise action, to formulate policy and supervise it, and to teach no longer exists. Now, at that point, I would like you to check me out by just reflecting on whether or not that is now actually the case. That in moral matters, people have only very questionable rights to act, to direct action, to formulate policy, and to teach. And what I'm saying most pointedly this evening is not to teach. The institutions of knowledge, that is, the ones that are set to convey knowledge in the culture, do not have the right and responsibility to teach knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil today. Okay, I think I've harassed you enough on that. I do urge you to have your questions coming. Some of you are old enough to remember when it was not that way. You ever hear a song called "All Hail Rock and Roll"? Chuck Berry? Up in the morning and off to school. Who can finish that? The teacher is teaching the golden rule. Now, actually, that was characteristic of the time Chuck Berry wrote that song. That is what has disappeared. Right? You don't teach the golden rule. You can say it at people, and you might scold them about it, but you don't teach it as a piece of knowledge. Sometimes in professional contexts that can be urged. John Maxwell has a book on There Is No Such Thing as Business Ethics. It's pushing a little bit, but his idea is simply that if you adopt the golden rule and implement it in business, you'll not need any other ethical provisions. But you should see how that is fought by people in the field of professional ethics. And there's some qualification that needs to be made, but his point is basically right. And it's the kind of thing that a business will assure you that they are observing. The word care, for example, is one of the most commonly used words in business advertisements. Watch how often it happens. We care. And of course, in another period, there was a lot of substance to that. Any Rotary members here? Rotary members? Do you know the Rotary slogan? Service above self. Service above self. Now that was produced by a group of Christian businessmen in Chicago many years ago. And when it was produced, it was just assumed, well, of course. Of course. And nowadays, very few people would know what that meant. Service above self. Once you explain it to them, then they see the point and realize there's something very important there. But professional ethics generally does not touch the issue of being a good person and doing the right thing. Professional ethics generally deals with how to stay out of trouble with your clients, with your fellow professionals, and with the law. And you look at it and you'll see that. And we need professional ethics, but we need them to be ethics. Right? But that's the area where you can't really go, because when you go to ethics, you're going to be judging about character and virtues and vices and good and evil, and that's what your professional codes today will almost never touch on. Now, if you read the codes that were written in 1900, you will see those coming up over and over. I have a book about that thick of codes for all kinds of organizations in the late 1800s. That's the difference, though. What could be dealt with then was mainly character, virtues, and vices, and also rules. They had plenty of rules, and a lot of the rules had to do with not infringing the interest of your fellow professionals. That's important. No question about that. And there are other kinds of issues like legalities, but it is a step further up if you're going to actually deal with ethics or morality. So now, I hope we've made that point. And so let's go now to number 2 on your sheet, and we want to talk for a while about how this came about. One of the most important things to understand is that it did not come about by some kind of discovery or invention. See, there are 2 ways that changes of ideas come about. One is someone makes a genuine discovery. For example, Harvey discovered the circulation of blood in animals. Now, it may be hard for us to imagine, but before that, they did not know that the blood circulated. They didn't know what a pump was until they invented them in Holland to drain the water back over the dike into the ocean. Once they had the idea of a pump, then they could begin to think about circulation, working with a pump. And so Harvey made a discovery. Now, after that, informed people understood that. Copernicus and some others discovered that, in fact, the earth goes around the sun. They discovered what we call heliocentrism with reference to our solar system. And there was a big brouhaha about it, of course. But after a certain period of time, that was settled. I mean, you probably don't get many discussions today about that question. And that's one way that ideas change. But there's another way that ideas change. For example, in the 14th through the 17th century, thousands of people were in one way or another killed because they were charged with witchcraft. And there was a pervasive belief in witches. No one went out one day and discovered there aren't any witches. Actually, you can get us a discussion about that today. Right? But by the 17th century, there was no longer enough consensus in society to continue to burn them. Right? And how did that come about? Well, progressively. Some people discussed it and talked about it. There were other changes in society until by the end of the 1700s, I think I said that wrong, by the end of the 1700s, you could no longer get the legal system and society to do that. They didn't discover it. It just became ridiculous. I mean, no one would think of setting up something to find out if some old woman actually got on her broom at midnight and rode around the countryside, or turned into a wolf and devoured a few of her neighbor's sheep. That's what you call a change in the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And what we're talking about here is a change of that same kind. No one discovered that you couldn't have knowledge or you shouldn't have knowledge of moral distinctions. It wasn't something that came as the result of a process of investigation. It's something that just grew up. And now I want to take a little time to just go over some of the factors. I've listed a bunch of them there on your sheet, and I can't discuss them all. And actually, I didn't put all of them on there, but we'll talk a little bit about some of them. Now, what we're talking about is how it came about that our institutions of knowledge no longer presented an understanding of moral distinctions as a body of knowledge. That's what we're talking about. How did that happen? Well, there are a number of factors there. The first thing I mentioned on the sheet is the removal of theology and religion from the area of knowledge. Now, this is a related and in some respects deeper change in the zeitgeist. Today, it's hard, I think, for many people to believe that theology and religion was once viewed as a source of knowledge. In nearly every college or university in the country, there were departments of theology, not religious studies, okay? That's a different story. Religious studies is a part of social science as it's now practiced. No, theology. And many times they were departments of theology and philosophy. They were ranked together. And the ethical truths that were advanced were fairly standard things from a biblical point of view, things like the Ten Commandments. People actually thought you knew that it was wrong to steal. But you knew that. It wasn't just a matter of emoting. They thought you knew that deceitful people were not good people. And they had the standard sort of teachings you would get from a thorough survey of biblical teachings on these matters. They thought that you knew these things because it was assumed that there was theological knowledge backing them up. Now then, in the last third of the 1800s, that changed. For various reasons, I can't go into tonight, but I can give you some references if you're interested in going into it yourself. That changed. That is, theology ceased to be regarded as an area of knowledge, and especially of an area of cognitive research. And as the universities turned more and more to research, it became more and more clear that theology as practiced was not an area of knowledge that could be sponsored by the universities. Now, I think at Notre Dame, some of you can probably tell me, they still have a Department of Theology. But you will find it hard to locate another school that has a Department of Theology. Now, if ethics were based on theology, and theology is not an area of knowledge, what follows for ethics? It's not an area of knowledge either. It's very interesting. If you want to study this, you might look at Julie Rubin's book, The Making of the Modern University. Julie Rubin's. The book is actually the development of a PhD dissertation she did at Stanford. She's now a professor of education at Harvard School of Education. It's just called The Making of the Modern University. And it's really illuminating to see how this developed. But as she recognizes, at the end, the university no longer sponsors, as knowledge, a body of ethical truth. Now, some of you will know that there is indeed a very rigorous moral code enforced at the university. But it's not expressed as knowledge. It's expressed as politics. And you know, in politics, you don't really have to know anything. It's a matter of winning and getting your way, but you don't have to know anything at all, except how to do that. And if you are, then you probably won't be a politician. You'll be someone who advises them. Second thing I have here is the disappearance of the human self as a domain of respectable knowledge. Now, in ethics, from Plato on, not to mention the biblical side of it, but from Plato on, ethics was totally focused on the soul until the modern period with Thomas Hobbes and others, and the soul begins to disappear. But when the soul disappears, the problem then is about the self. And there's a long story in philosophy, some of you will know it, about the disappearance of the soul. David Hume is a major figure in that process. But there are others, and up into the modern period, especially existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and others, fundamentally the self disappears. And the idea of the human being as a spiritual substance that undertakes its own direction by means of intentionalities and plans and choices, perhaps some form of education, to become a good person who does the right thing without having to think about it most of the time. That is lost to any kind of knowledge. You may know a book by Carl Jung called Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And the problem, especially from the 1800s on, is what to make of the human being. The disappearance of the human self and knowledge of the self from respectable knowledge is another part of what leads up to the disappearance that we're talking about tonight. And then, of course, you get social constructionist theories of the self, how the self is constructed socially. And it turns out again that dismisses the responsible person with knowledge guiding their lives. And you have various other things coming in here. Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, all of them hammering on this idea of the disappearance of the self from the conscious mind and the direction of life. Well, quickly, the third thing I mentioned, all cultures come to be regarded as equal. Now, I'm not taking up the issue of how much these are justified. I'm just saying that these are the things that lead to the disappearance of moral knowledge. For a long while, of course, people knew that there were different cultures and different things were approved and practiced. But up until pretty much the early part of the 1900s, it was simply assumed that, well, of course there were differences, but we're right and they're wrong. And then other cultures become a topic of scholarly investigation. And you will know the names of people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and others who, over a period of time, within their field, bring to the fore the idea that, no, we're not right and they're not wrong. We're just different. William Graham Sumner, who wrote a book called Folkways, and you would find it interesting on this particular point, perhaps. Folkways, William Graham Sumner, is the one who perhaps is mainly responsible for the idea that one culture is not better than another. Right? And so if that's true, then of course none are morally inferior. They're all just different. And then difference becomes itself a value. And there's no moral truth of the matter then about different cultures. Well, another point, moral distinctions and standards become viewed as power plays, as expressions of power. Marx and Nietzsche, of course, are primary in that area. Freud in a different way, but in all of them, the idea is that truth is not a matter of consideration, it's just a matter of who has the power. And then there's fear or resentment of knowledge itself. This actually is a part of what goes under C. Knowledge itself is viewed as oppressive in human and cultural matters. Colonialism becomes a big issue, and the suppression of people who have been colonized in terms of claims to superior knowledge on the part of the people who are oppressing them. And one way out of this is to disclaim knowledge so that the oppressor, usually Europeans of various groups, would come and say they had knowledge of what was good and right and so on, and suppress the native populations and say that their practices were not right, not good for human beings. So you turn that around now and say, well, if there's no knowledge, then they don't know that. And they might try to criticize you, but they can't criticize you if culture is what determines right and wrong, good and bad. Now, of course, it works the other way around too. The oppressed people cannot criticize the oppressors, but of course both sides go on and do it anyway, right? But the point is, there's no knowledge involved here. It's just a matter of the relativity of the cultures. Well, finally, just a couple of points here. Growth of the idea that it's always wrong to make a moral judgment. That has become almost a piece of law in many contexts, especially on the campuses. Now, of course, if there's no knowledge of moral matters, perhaps that's right. If there is knowledge of moral matters, then even though it is unpleasant, you might even have a responsibility to make a judgment. It's very interesting that in this area people have confused discernment and condemnation. And they think that condemnation is morally wrong, and it's the same as judgment, so you should never make a judgment. It helps worlds to be confused about things. Again, go back to your dentist. If your dentist looks at your tooth and says, that tooth has a big cavity in it and we're going to have to repair it, that's a judgment. And thank goodness for a dentist who would say it, right? Now, if he starts to slap you and scold you and say, who do you think you are to treat your teeth in this way? That's condemnation. See, those are different things. But if you're confused about that, then you will want not to say that anything is wrong, because that would be condemnation. And condemnation is bad. We let morality back under the door at that point. But there is a great reticence about making a moral judgment. And the idea is you could not make a moral judgment in love, so it becomes hate speech. Now, this is a touchy topic, but hate speech is often speech that someone hates. Now, there is such a thing as hate speech in the sense that it's ordinarily used, and it should not be done. It should be avoided, and that's a moral judgment, by the way. But to say that something is wrong is not hate. And you can murder people without hating them. So we have to think carefully about this whole issue of moral judgment, because this is one reason why people have backed away from the idea that there is moral knowledge. Because the idea is that if you thought there was moral knowledge, then you might make judgments. You see that? Am I making any sense to you? Right. And so in order to be nice, not to say moral or virtuous, I won't make moral judgments. Well, why don't I? Well, there really isn't any moral knowledge. You see how that works? So now, since the university is the arbiter of what counts as knowledge, and the philosophers, you notice almost all of the highest degrees are called the PhD. Now, that does not mean post-hole digger. It doesn't mean phenomenally dumb. It's Doctor of Philosophy. I'm redundant. I have a Doctor of Philosophy in philosophy. If you're in chemistry, you get a Doctor of Philosophy in chemistry. But the reason for that is because philosophy attempts to deal with the ultimate issues in every field in terms of the corresponding reality and the modes of knowledge of that reality. So it falls to philosophers to try to deal with the situation of the lack of moral knowledge. Now, let me tell you something interesting. They're not jumping up and down with joy about the disappearance of moral knowledge. Rawls and McIntyre are among the most morally serious people you will ever meet. Not as morally serious as G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore was so morally serious that those who thought they knew him best regarded him as naive. They couldn't tell the difference between earnestness and naivete. Moore was earnest about moral knowledge, moral properties, moral distinctions. And because he was victimized by people around him like John Maynard Keynes and the Bloomsbury Group in general, who used him to polish up their particular version of amorality. But Moore was very serious, and most of the people who have been engaged in this process have been deadly serious, extremely serious, about refounding, rediscovering moral knowledge. But they haven't succeeded. And it's very similar to what happened in the late 1800s with people like T.H. Green and Herbert Spencer and F.H. Bradley and even John Stuart Mill, where they realized that the theological basis of ethics was disappearing as far as society was concerned, and tried to provide a secular interpretation of the foundations of ethics. They all failed. That's what actually led up to the debacle that some of you may know as logical positivism or emotivism in ethical theory, where an ethical judgment is just an expression of emotion. Saying it is wrong to steal is like saying boo on stealing. It's right to be honest is hooray for honesty. That's, I think it was, I forget which philosopher right now, who, C.D. Broad, who called it the boo hooray theory of the moral judgment, because that's what it amounted to. And we haven't been able to get back from that. So that's a little longer than I had intended to spend on that.